Well, good morning, BridgeWay again, and as you can tell from that video, our topic today is Noah and the flood. If you are new or visiting with us, we have been in a series studying the great book of Genesis. In fact, if you got a Bible today, I would love for you to be able to read this account for yourself. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 6. This is all part of our series, How Easily We Forget. And I wanted to do this Bible story because I think you may know this story. You may know this story without actually having ever read the story. And I want to give you some confidence this morning in the events that occurred here in Genesis chapter 6 and in the life of Noah. Noah's kind of an interesting character. In fact, I think you could put him in a long list of people that are sort of inspiring as leaders. People like Winston Churchill, Leonardo da Vinci, Mother Teresa. And the strange thing is, history has a way of taking these notable people and sort of turning them into overnight successes. And what's often not seen is sort of the behind their story, the behind the scenes, the years that these leaders suffered rejection, failure, criticism, naysayers. In fact, you look at the life of the Wright brothers, and they were told that they would never fly. You look at Thomas Edison. He was chided by his own government. He was told that the light bulb would never surpass the candlestick. And on it goes, including this man, Noah. But there's something deep inside of what I believe is the human spirit to push past naysayers, to push past criticism even, and to seek a vision beyond something that just serves yourself. In fact, I want to tell you about one other guy, because sometimes it helps if you're lucky too, and that's the story of Theodore Geisel. This guy was a 1927 graduate of Dartmouth College, and all he wanted to be was an author. So he would write a book and take it to the publisher only to be rejected. Time after time, he would write and be rejected. In fact, he did this for 10 years. He was rejected by none less than 27 different publishers. He had lost all hope in his dream of being an author. He collected up his manuscripts, and he started marching down the road. He was taking them to a book-burning event. This is back in the day when they burned books. And by a chance encounter, on the same side of the street, he bumps into an old college friend from Dartmouth. And they start striking up this conversation. Theodore, where are you going? He goes, I'm burning my books. Why? Well, I'm giving up on being an author. And this friend said, well, what kind of books do you write? And he said, children's books. And this friend said, you wouldn't believe it. This past week, I got hired in the department, to lead the department for publishing of children's books here in town. And the rest, as they say, is history, because Theodore Geisel is Theodore Seuss, Dr. Seuss Geisel. And you think about this man, where would we be without Cat in the Hat and Green Eggs and Ham? He sold some 600 million books, 60 different books that he'd authored. I always think of him this time of year with graduates and oh, the places you'll go. I want you to see this morning that Noah's not just, lucky, and he's not just gritty. He's actually a part of God's plan. We've been talking throughout this series about the sovereignty of God. And it's not that Noah just wakes up one morning and is a overnight success. There's something about what God is doing in his life and in the time in which Noah lives that is remarkable for all of human history. We come to this story of Noah and the flood, and I imagine that it stirs maybe your thoughts, your questions, your imaginations even, kind of like that video. This is sort of one of those stories that is just sort of shrouded in a lot of criticism and debate. So I want to jump right into things this morning. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 6, as I said, and let me give you just a little bit of a recap if you haven't been here for our series. Genesis 6, as you can see by my Bible, is pretty early on in the historical account of humanity. In fact, things start off really, really well, but that only lasts for 2 chapters. God creates Adam and Eve, and as I've said throughout this series, there's this rhythm to God's creation. When God creates, it is good, and God creates, and it is good. And then there's a disruptor. It's sin. And Adam and Eve both do the one thing they were told not to do. They eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it plunges not only them, but all of humanity into what we would call the fall. And God punishes his creation by placing them outside of the garden, outside of perfection. I really hope you pick up on this language. He places them east of Eden. And you would say that today we live in that same direction. We're outside of God's perfection as seen in the garden. And things continue to unravel. They have 2 kids, Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel. And this shows us kind of this cycle that as humanity, we're not progressing, we're actually regressing. Evil on top of more evil. In fact, if you were here last week, we read the entire chapter of Genesis 5, and the whole point of Genesis 5 is just to take us from the man Adam to the man Noah. 1,056 years, and we studied one guy last week, Enoch. One guy in 1,000 years that walked faithfully with God until we get to this man, Noah. 1 in 1,000. And now we're going to read his account and how his journey through this flood begins. Genesis chapter 6. I'm going to read kind of a longer section starting in verse 9. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you will enter the ark, you and your sons, your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. And then here's the kicker. Look at how it ends. Noah did everything just as God commanded him to do. Now I'm reading just the introduction to this epic narrative. In fact, the flood starts here in Genesis 6, and it covers chapter 7, chapter 8, even a part of chapter 9. And we're just going to read the beginning, kind of the pre-flood stage. There would be the flood stage and the receding of the flood. And I wanted you to see kind of, it is a bleak and dire look at humanity. Things are getting worse until we come to this one guy, Noah. And we read in verse 9 that it said Noah was a righteous man. It means he was in right standing with God and was blameless among the people. It doesn't mean that Noah was perfect in any way, but he was in right standing. And in fact, it says that he walked faithfully with God. I said last week because that was really kind of the whole thing that Enoch teaches us, right? One man walked with God faithfully. It's like 1 in 1,000 years in the text. And I said that the church is that place where we live out kind of our Christian walk. And hopefully today, is another day in which the people around you become the people that are on journey, on your walk. And there should be no shame or no regret about asking someone, hey, how's your walk going? How's your walk with God treating you lately? How can I pray for you? What are you heading into this week? That should just be common. And again, it was very rare in the days of Noah. In fact, he is not only building a boat, but if you kind of summarize the whole story, it takes him 120 years to build this ark. And all along the way, he's pounding nails to build this boat, but he's also preaching and warning the people, hey, get your life right because a flood's coming. And I kind of imagine him as a fellow preacher like exhausting his voice, right? I mean, telling people, hey, flood's coming, change the way in which you're walking, turn directions, come towards God. And he preaches, and he pounds more nails, and he preaches, and no one repents. In fact, there's only 8 people that get into the boat. Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. And that's it. It's a dire straits for all of humanity. And so God sends this rain. I don't know, this is kind of fitting. We've had a lot of rain this past week. It's been raining all morning long. Tuesday night, I was sitting on my couch at about 6 p.m., and maybe you saw it too, like there was this spring thunderstorm. I love a good spring thunderstorm, and it was just so refreshing. But could you imagine 40 days of rain? And not only that, you're on this boat. Noah is 600 years old, we're told. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the flood actually lasts, according to the text, 150 days. In fact, before the boat rests and Noah and his family can come out of the boat, it is the duration of 1 full year. And again, this story, because of this kind of way in which it plays out, just raises all these questions. I want to get into the weeds a little bit this morning, because I hope in doing so that we can build some confidence in our faith as to not only the fact that this happened, but why this happened. I know there's lots of questions. I get them all the time. Pastor, how they fit all these animals on the boat? And then, of course, the logical question from anyone middle school on up is, what did they do with all the waste? Where'd they put all that manure? Really theological, deep questions. And so kind of just allow me this morning, there's at least 10 debatable issues in this story. I don't by any means want to drag this out as a Answers in Genesis with Pastor Ron. That isn't my intent. But I do want to kind of combine some of these questions, and I want to give you 4 of the most common, and I want to try to give you some answers, or at least some ways of thinking about the answers to these questions. So let's just hit kind of the first one. Probably the most common question is, did this really happen? We've kind of been through this age of deconstruction, and I've really seen it hit the Christian faith. In fact, I've got so many friends who are Christians who come to stories like this in the Bible, whether it's this or the parting of the Red Sea or any of the miracles of Jesus, and they think, well, did that really happen? Or is that just an allegory, Pastor? Is that just a story that teaches a lesson but didn't actually happen? You would call this kind of the question of historicity. And I've been around long enough to know that, if you just kind of say, well, the Bible says it happened, so it happened, well, that's what we call a circular argument. And so let me kind of take a moment and just kind of zoom out, and let me give you some information that would be considered sort of extra biblical, kind of accounts that happened outside of the Bible. And one of the most fascinating things about the story of Noah and the flood is this story is repeated from this point onward in history through all sorts of different cultures. In fact, at least 10 different cultures. I'll name just a few. The first and the most similar is a region just south of this area where this happened in Mesopotamia. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's kind of fascinating. I haven't read the whole thing, but it tells about this worldwide flood. It looks very similar. God calling a man, Ea, to build a boat to save humanity, and he does. And it's kind of, again, it's a really similar book. There's Greek history, which gets translated as Greek mythology, and that too includes a story of 2 people, Decalon and Pyrrha, who were warned that a flood was coming by the Titan Prometheus. And so they're warned of this flood, the gods are angry, and so they build an ark and survive the flood. And none of these accounts are the exact same as the Bible. In fact, in the Greek story, the 2 human beings come out of the ark and they pick up stones, and as they throw stones over their shoulder, every stone that hits the ground turns into a human life. Again, very different account of the story. There's a story in Hinduism of a worldwide flood. There's a story in Chinese history, mythology, of the goddess Nuwa who flooded the earth. Fascinating reads. Even in Native American history, especially in the traditions of both the Cherokee and the Navajo, they tell stories of how their ancestors survived this epic flood. So let me just kind of sum this up. If this event, if a flood didn't occur, then not only does Christianity have a lot of explaining to do, But all of these other cultures and traditions, which trace their way back, would have a lot of explaining to do. Science corroborates that there was something around this time that occurred that has affected all of human history. Kind of interesting, too, in the text are these dimensions that are given. Do you notice that it lists off these dimensions, and they're given in cubits? You can go home, get out your ruler, you won't find a cubit on it. A cubit was a very crude form of measurement. I read that it was either from your elbow to the tip of your hand, so that cubit is probably different from LeBron James' cubit. But sometimes they would measure the cubit from your shoulder to the tip of your hand. Again, it's just kind of strange the way in which they accounted for it. But if you do the math, and some scholars have, they would say that the Bible describes this boat as being 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Again, I wanted to show that video of the Ark exhibit because you got kind of an image of what it looked like. That's a replica of the actual size. You do the capacity of the volume on that boat, and science would say you could fit about 522 modern railroad cars on it today. Now, again, just kind of interesting how this works. Later in the story, in Genesis chapter 8, it tells that the boat comes to rest on Mount Ararat. This is actually a place you could visit. You could go climb Mount Ararat. It's in the Turkish region. It's a mountain, but it's also a mountain range. And I saw some video, some drone video. It's very remote. There's no inhabitants in this region. But interestingly, after World War II, British forces were trying to kind of like do aerials of this and map it out on a grid. And so they were taking aerial photos, and they recorded this photograph on this region, Mount Ararat region, and through geothermal imaging, this exact shape would match the 450 feet long, 75 feet wide. They don't really know 45 feet tall because they haven't excavated it entirely. It's very difficult. I'm not a geologist, but excavations at 6,500 feet above sea level, 13,000 feet is actually the mountaintop, of something that's over 6,000 years old is pretty difficult to accomplish. And this is sort of like tornado chasing, right? This is Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of material. But I do think this is interesting because it shows that the Bible is not a science book in the way in which we think of it, but there's nothing that's ever been found in the natural scientific world that's ever contradicted what the Bible has taught. So for me, I'll let you sweat out the details. I think there's enough evidence to say this event occurred. Second question that comes up a lot is, well, how'd they fit all the animals? And again, I gave you those dimensions and 522 rail cars. People have counted. They said at that time there were about 17,000 species. If you took the right size species, that would fit into about 200 of those rail cars. So I don't know, you think there's extra capacity on that boat for food and for lodging for Noah and his family, as well as all the waste, which people get so concerned about on the boat. There are kind of different ways of thinking about these animals, though. In fact, there's an entirely scholarly line that says you have to treat this story as if it's part of your faith. And part of your faith is mysterious and supernatural. If God can part the Red Sea, then couldn't God build a boat that sort of has this infinite capacity, right? Like you think of the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. I mean, we serve a God that is always offering to us an invitation to step into faith, to step into what we can't see with our rational minds. In fact, one scholar, can't believe I'm repeating this, he actually said the ark was like a Mary Poppins bag. That's scholarly research for you. You know, that you could just keep pulling things out and putting things in. I think there's actually a more realistic way, because that's the way my mind works, to think about this, to reconcile it, and it's kind of back to that idea of taking the right size animals. If the animals that came to him were actually young animals, baby animals, first of all, wouldn't that just be the cutest little parade, right? Like little baby elephants and zebras, you know? And Noah's not running around chasing these animals down. It says in the text that God would call these animals to come and to be saved from this flood. Again, lots of things to think about, but I do believe that, again, the text would say it is entirely possible. Here's kind of the next question. This one, super debatable. In fact, lots and lots of books have been written in both camps. Was the flood that we're talking about, was it a local flood, or was it something of a global nature? And there's a lot of sympathy for the idea of the flood being local. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I get a little torn on this question. Because if you think about it, God is rebooting all of human history, and he's dealing with a localized region of people. People have not spread to the ends of the earth yet. We'll get there in a couple chapters. We'll read about the Tower of Babel and the confusion of language and the spreading of humanity. But right now, they're kind of all locked into this region of modern-day Israel, Iraq, Turkey, kind of that Middle East. And I don't know, I just thought of, like, if God wanted to deal with something, he could. I mean, think if humanity just revolved around Rockford, right? And God looked down on Rockford and wanted to flood out Rockford. It's not that hard to think of, right? I mean, we've had some pretty big rains over the years, right? And you can think of the Grand River flooding. You can think of the Rogue River flooding. You can think of the Great Lakes flooding. It seems like a local flood would be sufficient to wipe out the humanity that's alive at that time. But I'm a literalist, and I think when I read this text, if we're talking about a complete restart of not only humanity, but of everything that's alive on earth, it would seem as though the text would indicate that a total flood, a total devastation would occur. In fact, there's all kinds of references to this. In verse 13, God says, I'm going to destroy both them and the earth, kind of this total destruction. You skip a chapter over into chapter 7, verse 19. The waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the mountains under the heavens were covered. I take that literally. I believe to the top of Mount Everest, this flood took place. But again, this is one of those things that isn't really an issue of salvation. So whether you think local or global, all we can say together is there was enough water to restart all of human history. And you can add this to the list of things you ask God when you get to heaven. Maybe the more ethical or theological question that comes up is usually from people outside of the Christian faith. And they say, how could God destroy human life? And this is kind of interesting because we see God having to deal not with just human life, but with the progress of evil. And I believe that if God didn't deal with evil in the way in which he did, that the way in which human history was headed is they were going to wipe out every person on earth. In fact, I skipped over Genesis chapter 6. You could read it this afternoon. I'll give you my summary of it. It demonstrates a world that is just becoming demonic. And I don't use that word lightly, but the demonic presence in Genesis 6 seems to reach a boiling point where God deals with evil. And I want to be really clear on this because I would make the statement and I would argue all day long that God is not just destroying human life. In fact, that's what's happening on earth. There's senseless violence, there's senseless murder. That's what's going on. God is not just destroying life. God is punishing and judging the sin that he has been warning them against for years. And I think in this story, what needs to happen, especially to our Sunday school versions of it, or maybe even our Hollywood versions of Noah and the flood, is we need to reframe the story and not just look at Noah, but actually look at what this teaches us about God. And in fact, I was helped so much by an old quote, theologian, a guy by the name of A.W. Tozer. And he's kind of writing from this idea of the attributes or the knowledge of God. And he says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. This is kind of this reframing, kind of being worked out in the way in which you think about God. If I say God to you, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And if what you think of when you think of God, the first thing is if you think, well, God is love, then I would say that part of God's love is expanding to see all the ways in which God acts throughout history. God is love, but God is also just. And if we don't think wholly about God in all the ways in which God works, we'll miss how God actually acts throughout all of history. If you think that God is just, well, petty or unjust or misogynistic, then very likely that'll be the view that you carry, not just of yourself, but it's what you will see in humanity around you. It's the lens through which we interpret all of life. And so when you come back to this idea of God dealing with evil in the world, God is certainly love, but God is also certainly a God of justice. And so if you just kind of look at this story and think, well, God would just allow evil to occur, God would maybe just sort of wink and turn his head to evil, then what it actually says is maybe there's something inside of you that doesn't want to deal with evil and justice here in your own life, in the world in which we live. And we see in the story that God does deal justly. He judges evil. And so kind of on the same theme of Tozer and kind of these attributes of God, I just want to close this morning because we get so hung up on Noah and all the what ifs and the questions. I wanted to kind of reframe this with just kind of thinking about who God is and the attributes of God. What does this story actually teach us about God? Three things. It first of all teaches us that God judges evil. I already dealt with that at great length. We see it throughout the text. God looks at the earth. He says the earth is corrupt. Everyone, every person is evil and violence, and God judges evil. But again, we want this expansive view of God, and so we have to hold this attribute of God judging evil also with this other attribute of God being incredibly patient with his humanity. I mean, think about the patience that God endures. I mean, he waits 1,056 years. And all along the way, he's just hoping. He's just waiting for humanity to kind of get themselves, pull themselves together and follow after him. And then he brings Noah and he says, punishment is coming for evil. And then God waits another 120 years. How many of you are that patient, right? No, none of us, right? I mean, if you're honest, you yell at the microwave, right? Like, come on, quicker, heat my food up. Or, I don't know, this week I was at a red light and it turned into a green light, and literally, from the time it took me to move my foot from the brake to the gas pedal, I got honked at. Like, hurry, move it up. You know, what's taking you so long? We are impatient as humanity. God is incredibly patient beyond this human capacity. He wants no one to perish, but for everyone to come to this eternal life that he offers. And so the solution is God offers us a covenant. And this idea of covenant is kicked off. He kind of says, I will establish my covenant with you, Noah, and with your family. We call it the Noahic covenant. Come back next week. It's Youth Sunday. And Justin and the team are going to do an awesome job celebrating our students, honoring our graduates. You don't want to miss that. But then come back in a couple weeks, week after that, we're going to come back into this idea of covenant and what this teaches us. Let me just tell you, this idea of covenant is just crazy. I mean, this is amazing grace. Noah is certainly chosen in this moment. And you see Noah, and I've highlighted, he's righteous. Noah is blameless. Noah is this boat builder. This is kind of the best version that Noah gets to be. But come back in a couple weeks, and you'll see that Noah does not finish well. And in fact, Noah really turns into this person who's a sinner. He gets drunk. He passes out naked in front of his family, causing shame all throughout history. I mean, it is literally a hillbilly redneck disaster. And yet God still pursues him. There's this incredible grace that God shows. See, what goes into that ark is not just Noah and his family and the animals. What goes into that ark is sin. And what comes out of that ark is also sin, and that solution is found only in Jesus Christ. And so this morning, I'm going to invite Eli and the team to come up, and they're going to lead us in a time of reflection. And my hope all this week is that this story would expand your view of who God is. This God that is both loving and just. This God that operates through patience. This God that pours out his covenant of grace to you and to me. I do also hope this morning, as you think about this story, that you're reminded of Noah and how he did everything just as God had commanded. And my hope this morning is that what God has placed on your heart, you would turn to him in obedience as well. So I want to pray for you as the team leads us here in this time. If you would just simply bow your head and pray with me, please. God, I thank you for this story. I thank you for this ark, this picture of our life ultimately being held by you, a holy and just God. And this ark is a place of safety. It's crazy to think. It's more like a lifeboat. There's no steering wheel. There's no rudder. Noah can't even get out of this boat. God, you shut him in, and it's the picture of what faith is commended of in Scripture. And so, God, I pray that you would use this story to strengthen us, that you would use this story to set us apart as holy and as blameless, and to walk in obedience with you. Jesus, we want to give you all the glory this morning. You came the first time in humility, but we know that you're coming back in all glory. And my hope is that we are found in you, in Christ, our ark and our salvation. We love you and we praise you. And everyone said,